The lights in the studio burned with an artificial heat that carried the weight of expectation. Former President Barack Obama was seated in his usual calm, collected posture, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He had come to the program that night ready to tout his legacy, especially his so-called historic victories on climate change. The producers had arranged a sleek backdrop filled with imagery of wind turbines, solar farms, and green landscapes, all meant to amplify his narrative. But sitting across from him was someone he hadn't expected to pose a real challenge, Karoline Leavitt. She was younger, sharper, and unafraid to go toe-to-toe with the man who once held the highest office in the world. While Obama's confidence seemed unshakable, Karoline's eyes carried a fire that made even the camera crew lean in a little closer. Obama began his opening remarks with the ease of a seasoned performer, referencing international accords, emissions reductions, and what he framed as America's leadership on the world stage. "We were the ones who got it done," he said smoothly, his cadence polished, every word carefully crafted for applause. Yet behind the practiced delivery, Karoline picked up the cracks. She knew the statistics, the realities, the gaps between his words and the truth. To her, Obama's so-called wins were paper-thin, policies riddled with loopholes, promises that never reached the working-class families who still bore the brunt of rising costs. She sat patiently, letting him build his tower of claims brick by brick, knowing that her moment to strike would matter more if she let him finish. When Obama leaned back, satisfied with his rhetorical foundation, Karoline finally leaned forward. The room grew noticeably quieter. "Mr. President," she said, her voice clear, unwavering, "you call them wins, but to millions of Americans, your words sound like empty speeches. You brag about reducing emissions while families couldn't afford heating bills. You celebrate global agreements while small-town industries collapsed under regulations that gave China and others a free pass. So my question isn't what you claim you achieved, it's whether you're ready to admit how little your legacy actually delivered." The silence that followed was electric. Obama adjusted his tie, his smile faltering for just a split second. It was the kind of silence that audiences felt in their bones, the moment when a carefully guarded image begins to fracture. Karoline had just set the stage for a clash no one expected, the polished veteran of political theater against the rising voice unafraid to call his words hollow. And the world was about to watch it unfold. The tension in the studio was unmistakable. Obama, usually quick with charm and an effortless retort, sat for a beat longer than expected. The hesitation didn't go unnoticed. Viewers at home would replay this moment, freeze-framing the exact second when his confidence cracked. He finally leaned forward, the smile returning but more forced now, like armor hastily strapped on. "Karoline," he said smoothly, "leadership requires vision. You don't reduce emissions overnight, you don't change the economy overnight. What we did was set the foundation for the future. If families struggled, it was because progress always comes with sacrifice. That's what history demands." It was classic Obama, elevated rhetoric designed to sound unassailable. The audience in the studio even gave a polite round of applause, trained by years of media to react to the cadence of his voice more than the content of his words. But Karoline wasn't there to play into the theatrics. She sat straight, refusing to yield even a flicker of intimidation. She leaned into her microphone. "Sacrifice?" she asked, her tone cutting. "Whose sacrifice, Mr. President? The factory worker in Ohio who lost his job because of overbearing regulations while you signed deals that padded global elites' pockets? The single mother who watched her electric bills double while your donors cashed green energy subsidies? You speak about sacrifice like it's poetic, but to ordinary Americans, it wasn't poetry, it was pain. And while you bragged about climate wins, China built coal plants at record speed. So again, what exactly did you win?" The applause stopped. The oxygen in the room seemed to thin as her words landed with undeniable force. Even the cameramen exchanged quick glances, aware they were capturing a moment that would be clipped, shared, and dissected across every corner of the internet by morning. Obama adjusted his posture, shifting tactics. "Karoline, with respect," he replied, his voice dipping into measured condescension, "Your generation loves to criticize but forgets that governing is complicated. We had to balance diplomacy, economics, and environmental priorities. Perfect outcomes don't exist. But progress does." And that was it, the pivot to vague abstractions, the retreat into generalities that once dazzled audiences but now rang hollow in the sharp light of Karoline's precision. She didn't blink. "No, Mr. President," she fired back. "That's not progress. That's public relations. And the American people are tired of politicians dressing up failure as vision." A low murmur spread through the crowd. The balance of power on stage had shifted. Obama might still be the icon of polished rhetoric, but Karoline had pierced the surface, exposing the emptiness beneath. For the first time, the former president wasn't in control of the narrative. The exchange was no longer just a political sparring match, it was theater, and the audience could feel the gravity of it. Obama had built a career on controlling the tempo, on being the calm in the storm, the voice that could lull opponents into compliance. But tonight, Karoline wasn't bending to his rhythm. She was dismantling it piece by piece, refusing to let him retreat into lofty language or detached abstractions. "Public relations?" Obama repeated, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite land. "Karoline, let's be honest here. The world looked to America for leadership. My administration delivered global accords that your generation benefits from today. You stand here criticizing, but what alternative did you offer back then? None, because you weren't in the arena." The line was crafted to sting, an old trick, diminish the critic by dismissing their experience. Some of the audience gave a scattered clap, relieved to hear Obama punch back. But Karoline leaned in, her eyes unflinching, her voice cold and direct. "You're right, I wasn't in the arena back then," she said, pausing deliberately, letting the silence stretch. "But I am now, and I won't let you rewrite history. You call them global accords, I call them blank checks to foreign polluters while Americans footed the bill. You claim vision, I see negligence. Families didn't feel leadership, they felt betrayal. And the proof is in the air, emissions worldwide rose under your watch. That's not leadership, Mr. President, that's a photo op." The words landed like a hammer. The audience froze, not out of politeness this time, but out of shock. It was rare for anyone to go toe-to-toe with Obama in real time and refuse to be dazzled by his aura. Karoline had not only refused, she had flipped his strategy against him. Obama inhaled slowly, visibly recalibrating. His team backstage was no doubt frantically messaging producers, trying to steer the narrative. He leaned forward, a touch sharper now, his tone edging toward frustration. "It's easy to sit in judgment after the fact," he countered. "Leadership is about choices under pressure, not hindsight perfection. You think you could have done better? That's arrogance, not wisdom." Karoline didn't flinch. "No, Mr. President," she replied, her voice steady but cutting. "What's arrogant is telling struggling Americans that their pain was necessary while pretending it was progress. Leadership isn't measured by how many speeches you gave in Paris. It's measured by whether the people at home could still keep the lights on, still put food on the table, still trust their leaders. Under you, they couldn't." The crowd erupted, not with applause this time, but with an audible rumble of gasps, murmurs, and shuffling. Obama's carefully maintained image was cracking on live television, and Karoline was the one swinging the hammer. For a fleeting second, Barack Obama's trademark composure faltered. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed tight, and the calm professor tone that once carried him through debates seemed to slip. The crowd could sense it, the great orator was searching for footing, and Karoline had made the floor uneven. He straightened in his chair, forcing a measured smile. "Karoline, politics isn't a sermon of absolutes," he began, tone clipped. "It's about trade-offs. Yes, not every policy was perfect. But I'll remind you, it's easy to throw darts from the gallery. The question is, can you do better when the burden of responsibility is on your shoulders?" It was the familiar Obama pivot, paint the critic as naive, emphasize the weight of leadership, deflect from the core accusation. For years, this tactic had silenced opponents, re-establishing him as the seasoned adult in the room. But tonight, the effect didn't land. The audience had just seen him rattled, and Karoline wasn't about to let him reset the board. She leaned forward, eyes locked on him, her tone unwavering but laced with iron. "Mr. President, don't mistake my refusal to play along as naivete. Responsibility means telling the truth, not selling illusions. Responsibility means protecting your own people first, not lecturing the world while Americans lose faith at home. You speak of trade-offs. Well, here's what you traded. You traded American jobs for applause in Paris, you traded energy independence for dependency on adversaries, you traded credibility for photo ops. And now, years later, you sit here and call that leadership?" Her words cut with surgical precision, every clause striking deeper. The audience was transfixed, some nodding, some murmuring, others shifting in their seats as if they too felt the weight of the accusation. Obama tried to interject, "Well, that's an oversimplification," but Karoline raised her hand slightly, not in rudeness, but in command, the way a litigator pauses a witness mid-excuse. "No, Mr. President. Oversimplification is telling coal miners they can learn to code while watching their communities collapse. Oversimplification is saying climate speeches equaled progress while emissions rose worldwide. The truth is simple, but it's not flattering. That's why you avoid it." The room erupted, not in applause, but in a stunned silence broken by scattered gasps and the faint hum of the cameras capturing every twitch of Obama's jaw. For the first time in years, he wasn't the teacher at the lectern. He was the defendant, and Karoline had just flipped the script into cross-examination. The moderators exchanged nervous glances, papers shuffling like dry leaves in a sudden storm. This was not the script they'd envisioned. What was supposed to be a polished forum showcasing Obama's familiar authority had devolved into something raw, unpredictable, and electric. The control room's voices buzzed in their earpieces, "Reel it in. Cut to commercial if needed." But the producers hesitated, because the nation was watching, and the moment was too gripping to abandon. Obama adjusted his tie, his calm facade returning by sheer willpower. "Karoline, I understand the allure of soundbites," he said, leaning forward with the professor's cadence he wielded so well. "But governing isn't about scoring points. Governing is about compromise, about finding common ground, about making incremental progress. Perfect is the enemy of good." It was an old refrain, measured, steady, logical. The crowd nodded softly, some relieved at the familiar tone. But Karoline saw the weakness in it, the return to abstraction, the safe ground of platitudes. She pounced. "Mr. President," she said firmly, her voice cutting across the stage like a bell, "you keep talking about compromise as if it's a virtue in itself. But compromise with failure is still failure. Compromise with lies is still deception, and incremental progress? That's just a polite way of saying you moved the ball a few inches while the clock ran out on the American people." The audience reacted audibly this time, gasps, murmurs, even a smattering of applause. The moderators froze, uncertain whether to intervene or let the moment explode. The camera zoomed in on Obama, whose jaw tightened again. He tried to interject, but Karoline's momentum was unstoppable. "You called me out for throwing darts from the gallery," she continued, locking eyes with him. "But the truth is, Americans didn't elect you to give speeches in galleries of Paris or lecture halls in Davos. They elected you to deliver results at home. And tonight, you want to tell me that perfect is the enemy of good? No, complacency is the enemy of leadership. And you perfected that art." The room erupted. The moderators whispered frantically, their composure crumbling. One of them leaned into the mic, "All right, let's shift the conversation," but the interruption was drowned out by the reaction of the crowd. Karoline leaned back at last, not smug, not triumphant, but resolute, her words hanging heavy in the air. She had flipped the stage dynamics entirely. Obama was no longer the mentor addressing a student, he was the man being confronted by the very voice of the people he once claimed to represent. The atmosphere inside the hall had shifted so dramatically it was almost tangible. What had begun as a polite exchange was now an unmistakable clash of generations, visions, and values. The cameras caught everything, the sweat beading at Obama's temple, the fierce light in Karoline's eyes, the crowd hanging on each word as though history itself was being written in real time. Obama leaned forward, voice steady but sharper this time, as if he had decided that patience was no longer the best strategy. "Karoline, it's easy to stand here and criticize," he said, gesturing broadly to her with an open palm. "But you've never had to sit in the Oval Office, balancing competing priorities, facing a divided Congress, dealing with international crises. It's a lot harder than just calling people complacent." The crowd gave a polite smattering of applause, his base, relieved to hear the confident Obama return. But Karoline didn't flinch. She took a step closer to her podium, speaking directly into the moment. "With all due respect, Mr. President," she fired back, "you're right, I haven't sat in the Oval Office. But the people who have sat there, including you, were elected to solve problems, not to explain them away. And if being in the Oval Office means lowering expectations, diluting promises, and delivering excuses, then maybe what America needs isn't more Oval Office experience, maybe what it needs is honesty." The hall buzzed, some with shock, some with cheers. A cameraman whispered, "Don't cut, this is gold." The moderators looked rattled but powerless. Obama raised his chin, his tone sharpening into something almost scolding. "Honesty without responsibility is just performance. You can rile people up, sure. You can point out flaws, sure. But until you're tested in the fire of leadership, your words remain just that, words." Karoline didn't hesitate. "And yet, Mr. President, my words are resonating more right now with this audience than your polished defenses." "Why?" "Because Americans are tired of speeches about why nothing can be done. They're tired of leaders blaming the process instead of changing it. If leadership is only defined by survival, then no wonder Washington is broken. Leadership should be defined by courage, and courage doesn't hide behind excuses." The crowd erupted again, this time louder, longer, undeniable. People were standing, clapping, shouting in support. The moderators leaned toward each other, one whispering, "We've lost control of this broadcast." Obama's eyes narrowed. He was used to tough interviews, tough critics, but rarely had anyone stood toe-to-toe with him on live television and refused to blink. Karoline didn't just question his record, she challenged his entire definition of leadership. And in that moment, the audience was siding with her. Obama straightened in his chair, visibly aware that the audience was leaning more toward Karoline now than toward him. He was a master of rhetoric, but even he could feel the balance shifting. His instinct told him to regain control by reframing the debate, to pivot back to familiar ground where his authority was unchallenged. He tapped the table lightly, a subtle signal he often used when he wanted attention reset in his direction. "Look," Obama began, his voice steadier than before, "I admire your passion, Karoline. I really do. But passion isn't policy. Passion won't reduce carbon emissions. Passion won't rebuild communities destroyed by wildfires. Passion won't get a divided Congress to move an inch on legislation. At some point, leaders have to live in reality, not just in ideals." There it was, a calculated move to diminish her, to cast her as naive. The audience, sensing the sharpness in his tone, responded with mixed noises. Some clapped, others booed. The tension thickened. Karoline leaned forward, her tone cool but cutting, every word sharpened with intent. "Mr. President, with all due respect, passion built this country. Passion ended slavery, passion fueled the women's suffrage movement, passion drove civil rights marches, and passion inspired countless Americans to demand a better nation. To dismiss passion as not reality is to ignore the very force that has always changed reality. Without passion, we'd still be living in the comfort of excuses." The crowd exploded, cheers, whistles, even some chants of her name. A young college student in the audience shouted, "Tell him, Karoline." The moderators scrambled to keep the program orderly, but it was too late. The atmosphere was electric and raw. Obama tightened his jaw, and his counterattack came quickly. And yet, without compromise, none of those movements would have become law. None of that passion would have mattered without leaders willing to take half a step when they couldn't get a full one. Idealists make noise, realists make progress. Karoline seized the opening. Her voice rose, but not in anger, in clarity. Realists make excuses. Idealists make history. Which one do you want to be remembered as, Mr. President? The man who spoke eloquently about change but left the hardest promises unfulfilled, or the man who dared to match his words with action? Because right now, the legacy looks like speeches, not solutions. The hall erupted again. Obama leaned back, silent for a beat too long. The cameras caught it, an image that would be replayed endlessly. Karoline on the offensive, Obama momentarily stalled, the audience roaring in approval of her challenge. She didn't stop there. And let me be very clear, this isn't about me versus you. This is about Americans who don't want to be told that nothing can change. This is about people who are tired of waiting for reality to catch up while their families struggle. They want leaders with courage, not excuses dressed as wisdom. And if passion scares the political elite, maybe it's because it threatens the comfort of complacency. The moment belonged entirely to her now. The camera zoomed in on Obama's face. His expression was measured, but the subtle narrowing of his eyes revealed what words couldn't hide. He felt cornered. He wasn't used to losing ground in front of a live national audience. The instinct that had carried him through decades of debates and interviews told him to pivot once more, to reclaim authority before the evening slipped fully into Karoline's hands. He adjusted his tie and leaned forward, speaking with a deliberate cadence. Karoline, you're right that passion matters. You're right that America is built on it. But when you stand here and accuse leaders like me of empty words, you ignore the thousands of lives we've touched through compromise, through incremental change. Leadership is about knowing when to fight and when to build consensus. If you don't understand that balance, then your words are just noise, loud, exciting, but ultimately unproductive. The line drew applause from part of the audience. Obama's supporters seized on it, relieved that he seemed to regain footing. But Karoline wasn't shaken. She allowed the clapping to wash over the hall, waiting until silence returned. Her pause was strategic, commanding. When she finally spoke, her tone carried the weight of inevitability. Noise, she repeated, tilting her head slightly. If standing up for Americans who are tired of broken promises is a noise, then maybe this country needs more of it. Because what you call consensus, people outside this studio call gridlock. What you call incremental progress, families call waiting another generation for justice that should have been delivered yesterday. The audience erupted, louder than before, chants beginning to ripple, Karoline. Karoline. The moderators shifted nervously, realizing this wasn't just a debate anymore, it was turning into a cultural flashpoint. Obama tried to cut in. You oversimplify complex. Karoline raised her hand sharply, not to silence him but to hold her ground. No, Mr. President. I clarify what politicians like you complicate. People don't need another decade of speeches about tomorrow. They need leadership that acts today. You're worried about being remembered as a realist. But let me tell you, realists rarely make history books. The ones who do are those who dared to be called dreamers, radicals, or even noisemakers. And that, sir, is the difference between managing decline and igniting revival. The word struck like thunder. Even those in the audience loyal to Obama fell silent, some exchanging glances that betrayed doubt. For the first time, the former president seemed like the one defending a fragile position, while Karoline stood as the voice of unapologetic clarity. Cameras caught Obama exhaling, as though he knew the momentum was slipping away for good. Karoline stood taller, every gesture signaling that this moment was hers. The broadcast, meant to showcase a clash of ideas, had instead become a referendum on legacy, and Karoline had just turned the verdict against one of America's most celebrated political figures. The energy in the room made it clear, this battle wasn't ending with applause. It was the spark of something larger. Obama leaned forward again, almost as if his body language could force authority back into the conversation. His voice steadied, the tone of a professor trying to reclaim a classroom. "Karoline, you speak with energy, I'll give you that. But history isn't written by those who shout the loudest. It's written by those who govern responsibly. It's easy to criticize from the sidelines. It's harder to sit in the Oval Office and make choices that balance ideals with realities." It was a polished line, one he had used countless times before, but tonight it fell flat. The words seemed recycled, drained of power. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't even look impressed. Instead, she leaned slightly toward her microphone, the intensity in her eyes locking the entire audience in place. "Mr. President," she said slowly, "what you call responsible, the American people call excuses. You say history isn't written by those who shout the loudest. But maybe history isn't written at all when leaders get so tangled in excuses that nothing changes. You talk about realities. Well, the reality is families are working 2 jobs just to keep their lights on. The reality is communities are drowning in crime while politicians promise reform, someday. And the reality is young Americans don't believe in the system anymore, because every speech from leaders like you sounds like the last one, full of hope, short on action." The crowd reacted instantly. Some gasped, others applauded, but the overwhelming sense was that Karoline had just cut through the noise with a blade of truth. Even viewers at home could feel it, the shift from rhetoric to raw clarity. Obama opened his mouth, ready to interrupt, but Karoline raised her voice just enough to hold the stage. "Let's stop pretending this is about shouting. This is about daring to say out loud what millions are whispering at their kitchen tables every night. You may have sat in the Oval Office, but you left millions outside its doors. And now you want to tell me I'm too loud? Sir, my voice doesn't belong to me, it belongs to them." The hall shook with applause. A camera panned across the audience, young faces nodding, older ones clapping reluctantly, some even standing. Obama leaned back, visibly unsettled. His measured calm, once his greatest weapon, looked suddenly like detachment. Karoline pressed forward, her voice sharper now. "You called me noise. But maybe I'm the sound of a generation that's done waiting. Maybe I'm the voice of a people who don't want more speeches about tomorrow, they want leaders who will act today. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe the discomfort means the truth finally landed." It was a direct strike, and for the first time that evening, Obama had no immediate retort. He looked down at his notes, then back at Karoline, his silence louder than anything he could have said. The moderators glanced nervously at one another, sensing they were no longer in control. The audience had given the verdict, this was Karoline's moment, and Obama, despite all his eloquence, was left defending shadows against a rising fire. The moderator's voice tried to break through the roar of the audience, "We need to move on," but it was pointless. The cameras, the lights, the millions watching at home, they weren't moving anywhere. All eyes were locked on Karoline. Obama attempted a final pivot, forcing a smile as if to reclaim dignity. "At the end of the day," he said, "America moves forward when we focus on hope, not cynicism. That's what people need right now, hope." It should have landed as his signature note, the same hopeful cadence that carried him to victory years ago. But this time, it felt like a relic. The words hung in the air with no applause, no energy, no spark. The audience had already shifted. And Karoline knew it. She leaned in, her voice low at first, then rising like a tide. "Hope is powerful, Mr. President. But hope without honesty is empty. Hope without accountability is betrayal. You spent 8 years selling hope, and Americans are still waiting for the bill to be paid. They don't want recycled slogans. They want leaders who can look them in the eye and admit the system is broken, and then have the guts to fix it. The silence was deafening. Obama froze, his smile faltering. It wasn't just Karoline calling him out, it was the unspoken agreement in the room that her words rang truer than his. And then she delivered the line that would dominate every headline, every social media feed, every political conversation for weeks. You don't get to lecture this generation about hope, Mr. President. Because hope was your promise. And broken promises don't inspire, they haunt. The crowd erupted. Some jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering. Others shook their heads, stunned by the audacity. The moderators sat frozen, aware they had just witnessed the moment that would define the night, and possibly a political era. Obama glanced down at his notes, then up at Karoline. For the first time, he looked smaller, diminished not by insult but by truth. The camera zoomed in on Karoline's steady expression, calm, unflinching, resolute. The debate moved on, technically, but nothing afterward mattered. The narrative had already crystallized. Barack Obama, the man who once owned hope, had been stripped of it live, in front of the nation, by a young voice unwilling to back down. And as the broadcast cut to commercial, the hashtags were already trending, #BrokenPromises, #Karoline vs. Obama. And most viral of all, simply, hope haunts. In the end, Barack Obama stood on that stage reaching for his old magic, hope, change, inspiration. But Karoline Leavitt refused to be dazzled by the past. With calm precision, she tore through the glossy slogans and exposed the broken promises that still weigh on Americans today. She didn't just debate him, she stripped away the myth. The moment she said, "Broken promises don't inspire, they haunt," the nation felt it. One side of history closed, another opened. And in that silence, America realized, the torch had already passed.